Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. A crossover that many have been requesting. It is finally time for the two Alexes to meet here as we predict the 53-man roster after minicamp here. So, Alex, how are you doing today?
Doing good. Wearing my Sonic shirt in honor of the NBA draft.
Yeah.
Bring the Sonics back. But yeah, excited. Minicamp was seems like it went well for everyone, and excited to talk about the 53. I think it's a little bit more straightforward than it was last year. But still a couple spots where there's going to be plenty of debate, I'm sure. So should be fun.
Yeah. I think it is a little bit more straightforward just because of what they did in the draft, more so than anything else, and just spots that you kind of like have to have for guys now. But yeah, I think we'll still have quite a bit of fun here. So I guess we can get started. Let me just share one of my tabs here where I do have the 53-man roster kind of pulled up here, or it's not pulled up, but we're going to fill it in and then hope that my math is good enough so we can continue to add up the numbers and it comes out to 53 at the end. Because as I was writing my Chargers Wire article this week, I was like, does 22 plus 4 give me 26? Does it? So eventually get into that territory with this too. We'll start with quarterback. So quarterback, we're thinking 3 at this point.
Yeah, I think especially I think that it was always going to be three once they drafted Duggan, but now, especially now that they've changed the rules about the game day actives with the quarterbacks, I think there's really not any reason to not have three, especially because between Stick and Duggan, like I do think it's going to be more of like a true competition for QB2, but I think that whoever loses that, you probably don't want to risk getting poached on waivers, and so you probably just go ahead and take all three of them. And if it means three quarterbacks are on the active again, then that's the price you have to pay, I guess. That's what happens when you re-sign Easton Stick. So yeah, I think it's going to be all three.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be all 3 as well. I think this was true probably before the draft as well, but investing the 7th round pick into Duggan, doing that, and, Tom Telesco is kind of only emboldened by the new Niners rule, as you suggested and laid out there. This is just kind of how they operated. They liked having 3 quarterbacks, and now I think more so they're going to be kind of in the norm of having 3 quarterbacks now around the league. I don't think that there's going to be many teams that just roll with 2, especially because there isn't really that incentive anymore, or like, in terms of building out the roster. So I think they go with 3. There is still part of me from previous years where I don't think it's necessarily the smartest roster building move, but I wouldn't have necessarily drafted Max Duggan anyway. But I do think he's here. He is going to be the mind in the quarterback room, much like Stick was in previous seasons. So, I think keeping 3 makes sense there. On to running back, I guess, is next. This one I think is a little bit more interesting just because this could come down to some free agent additions, right? Like if they want to add a running back in free agency, then you're probably considering keeping 4. Obviously, that goes into like some of the Zeke stuff, or if they want to do that come training camp or add another body, much like in the way they added Sony Michel last year. They could do something like that. I think if it's the current guys on the roster, though, then it is probably Eckler, Kelly, and then Spiller. And then Roundtree is going to be your sort of like practice squad back who might be brought up for special teams sometimes. But for now, I do think it's those 3 guys.
Yeah, I guess how do we want to count Xander Horvath also? Because I think that he's going to be on
I
those
did put a
three.
tab for fullback there. So yeah, he
Okay,
is
perfect.
yeah, we can put
Yeah,
him in right now. So that would be 4, I guess,
yeah.
between those.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I do think that there's a chance that Roundtree ends up making the final 53,
Mm-hmm.
if they want, especially if they don't add anyone during training camp or, like up until the beginning of the season. Just because it seems like they prefer him to play special teams over someone like Spiller.
Yeah.
But obviously, like a ton of that is going to depend on the strides that Spiller has made over the offseason and what he looks like in training camp and what he looks like in the preseason. And like if he's going to have a bigger role as an actual running back this year, behind Eckler and potentially behind Kelly. I would say as of right now, behind Kelly. Um, and so you don't necessarily want Kelly to take a ton of special teams reps. Maybe you sneak Roundtree onto the 53 for that reason. But otherwise, I would say I would agree that like I think Roundtree is basically like the 54th man here, um, where like he's going to be on the practice squad. He's going to use up all three standard elevations, like weeks 1 through 5, probably. And then, like, if someone goes on IR, he's like the first guy that gets called up and put on the active roster for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And yeah, it really depends on just, I guess, how much they trust Isaiah Spiller, because that's kind of my big like thing in terms of building this out. If they want to go through free agency, then that would kind of tell you they're less inclined to like believe it. If they want to add somebody like Zeke or somebody else who's in free agency, I don't think they're going to do that as of now. I think they have enough belief that he will take another step at this point. But yeah, that I think is like kind of the differentiator. And like you said, I'll fill in Horvath here because I do think obviously he's making the roster, and also he has no competition, right? There was always kind of like
Yeah.
a neighbors or somebody who was like there to like maybe push, but at this point the Chargers seem pretty satisfied with who their fullback is going to be. Okay, so now we are at wide receiver. So I think this one is also kind of interesting because the Chargers historically under Staley have kept 5. But this year is a little bit different because they drafted Johnston and they drafted Davis, and they still have Jalen Guyton who's coming back from his ACL injury. So thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's gonna have to end up being 6.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the only way it doesn't end up being 6, on the initial 53 is if for whatever reason Guyton has to start on like pup or
Mm,
something like that. Like he's not ready to go as soon as the year starts. But otherwise, I would be pretty surprised if it wasn't 6. I think the 6 are pretty obvious. Williams, Allen, Johnston, Palmer, Davis, Guyton. I think that Davis is probably going to be basically what the Chargers wanted DeAndre Carter to be last year before everyone got injured, where it's like
right.
you're going to be wide receiver 5, and so you might catch like one pass a game, ideally, but like basically you're just on the team to return kicks and return punts. Um, And so if you're gonna have a specialist like that on the roster where like your vision for him is to not play a huge role on offense, I think you have to keep someone like Guyton, who's more proven as like a deep threat actual receiver type. Um, so I feel like that just makes the most sense. But I could see them keeping 5, I guess. Like maybe Guyton doesn't make it to the 53. I'd be pretty surprised if that was the case, but I feel like the only reason that that would be the case is if like his ACL recovery goes like has gone terribly, or he just doesn't look like he has the same amount of juice or something. But I think that initially it's going to be 6, and they're going to give Guyton kind of that time to get fully back up to game speed.
Yeah, I think they give him that time too, and I think it's 6 to start. Yeah, the only way that I see it being 5 on the initial 53 is if they go, okay, we'll put Guyton on pup, and then they have the early bye in week 6 this year, is it week 5, week 6?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
5, I think.
yeah, 5, and then into the Dallas game they come out of that. So like theoretically, if you want to give him like a month and a half to kind of like get right, then and have it be a full year after the ACL, and if it's not going well, then you can kind of do that. Aside from that, though, yeah, I don't see many scenarios where like he wouldn't be on the roster. And you've already seen like kind of wide receivers at training camp talk about the inclusion and Guyton being back. plus I just think if you were to roll with five, like in standard fashion here, and leave Jalen Guyton off, that's kind of putting a lot of more pressure on Darius Davis or somebody like that when you don't necessarily have to, right?
Definitely.
So I think that just, yeah, keeping six in this instance is just a much better option than keeping five, and it has you be a little bit more versatile, especially when, your two top receivers last year, missed about 10 games combined, 11 if you count the Jacksonville playoff game for Williams. So in that sense, I just think it makes a lot more sense to keep six there, even though part of the reason, they drafted Johnson was for that. I think just you want more receivers in general, especially with that receiving core. Let's go to tight ends now. This one's, I guess, a little bit interesting because I could see it being 3 or 4, depending on how they decide to play it out. I also think out of all the offensive positions, this is the one that's most likely for a free agent addition if they want to get a true blocker, because right now it's kind of something they're lacking. They can go, for Jeff Swaim or Kyle Rudolph potentially in free agency there. I don't necessarily know if they're going to get that done before training camp, but would like to see kind of something because right now they don't have a true blocker. Parham, I think, is a good enough blocker. Everett is Trey McKitty. So at this point, I do think you need to have that fourth guy, and then that kind of would balance out the roster right now. If they were to do that, that would be Stone Smart. But yeah, so is it 3 or 4 tight ends for you?
When I went through and did it before the show, I put 4 and I had Smart on there, but like on the bubble, like
Mm.
pretty much like if not the 53rd guy, then like the 52nd guy. I do think that adding a fourth tight end via free agency is something that Chargers fans should definitely be keeping an eye on, especially with some of the names that you mentioned, especially like I know Jeff Swaim has been someone that's drawn a lot of interest, obviously has familiarity with Kellen Moore and everything, just like, you know, negotiations take a long time, don't actually know if they're actually negotiating or if it's just like a rumor thing and it's unsubstantiated, the whole thing. I do think, generally speaking, just like with Parham's injury history and Everett kind of being prone to getting dinged up here and there, and McKitty really being like a nothing as a receiver, I think that you have to pencil in 4 on the opening 53. Whether that means that it's gonna be Stone Smart or a free agent ad, I think doesn't really matter necessarily because I think they're going to keep 4 regardless. And so it's really just a matter of like, is it a free agent ad that's taking Stone Smart's roster spot or is it Stone Smart? I don't really think that Camp Moyer or the UDFA, Ezeiki from UCLA, I don't really think that they're going to factor into this a ton. Both of them are pretty decent blockers. I just think that they're probably fighting for one practice squad spot between the two of them and not really like an actual 53 spot. And so I think just the way that the math works with the injury history and everything, I think you have to pencil in 4. And for now, obviously, because no one else is on the roster, I think it has to be Stone Smart.
Yeah, I would have it being Stone Smart as well for now. Um, the only, I guess, area where I think this could get like hairy later on is if you're debating between like which positions need the most depth because of potential injuries. I'll mention one on the defensive side of the ball when we get there. But yeah, offensive line, I don't think there's any real surprises here. I think they keep the standard 5, which from left to right is obviously Slater, Zion, Lindsley, Jamari Salyer, and Trey Pipkins. And then you're looking at Will Clapp backing up Corey Lindsley. You're looking at Jaimes being in that backup 4 as well. And then Foster Sarrell, I guess, is your swing tackle. Is there... Oh, there should be a ninth name in
McFadden.
there, I guess. Who would be the ninth, I guess, offensive
McFadden,
lineman?
the fifth rounder.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot. Jordan McFadden.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jordan McFadden will be there as well. So then that is your 9. So
Yeah.
that'll be Foster Sarrell, Brendan Jaimes, Will Clapp, and Jordan McFadden. I think it was, I don't remember if it was Staley who said it, that it was Austin Pleasance, I think, this week in minicamp, who was like running second unit, or he was running with the second unit. So that's something to watch. Don't give him much of a chance to make the roster, especially because of the Jordan McFadden pick. But worth noting potentially for like a practice squad spot.
Yeah, for sure. I do think this is pretty straightforward. I think that uh, perhaps in another universe, Hymus is a lot closer to being on the bubble than he is
Yeah,
in our universe, just because he's not been very good. But you look at the other names that are uh, pushing for a spot, and they either don't offer the same flexibility that Hymus does, where like Hymus can play either guard spot and I guess theoretically play center, um, or they're just even less proven than Hymus is, which is saying kind of a lot. But basically, like the guys that you're leaving off here, with the exception of Pleasance, who sounds like has performed well in minicamp, like you're talking about Zach Bailey, who lost the swing tackle job to Foster Sarrell last season, and then two UDFA's and two UDFA's from last year that got injured in training camp and missed the entire season. So not really like a ton of depth options there. So I think that you have to carry nine. I think that the ninth has to be Hymus, for the reasons that you said. And like in a perfect world, Hymus could be the 10th and kind of be the super sub from the practice squad, but I think that they just don't have the depth for that to be possible right now.
yeah. Right now, I definitely think it's kind of a depth issue as to why James is kind of like on this roster as opposed to the practice squad, despite kind of like the not being proven thing, like you said. Um, this offensive line just kind of gets interesting in general. It's one of those things where the health of this unit, like, kind of needs to hold up if this team is going to be a contender as a whole. You could say that for any year, but I think specifically this year, now that you don't have like the benefit. I mean, Filer was a starter last year, but you can't like bring someone like a Filer or like off the bench or something. Now that he's in like Tampa, so that would be a thing where it was like, if you want someone who could like start a game at a pinch, that would be like kind of a perfect like veteran older guy. But yeah, um, do not feel good about Foster Sarrell coming into a game based off of what we saw
No,
last year.
not really.
So yeah, that kind of is what it is in terms of the depth. We talk about offensive line. I guess switching here to defensive side of the ball, I think defense is a little easier to predict than offense at this point, because offense we could talk about like the Guyton thing. Do they keep 5 or 6? The free agent additions potentially, running back and tight end. I do think when we talk about like edge, for example, let's start there. It's pretty much the 4 guys. I do think it is Bosa, Mack, Rumpf, and of course Tuli Pelotu, who currently has yet to sign, but will mostly likely before training camp or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think pretty straightforward. The only guy who maybe makes a push to like make them include a fifth edge rusher is I guess like Ty Shelby, who had a really good training camp last season, then ended up getting injured right at the end.
Mm.
And so like just wasn't really like in a position to be on the final roster. But there were a bunch of guys last season that I thought pushed for, a spot as a fifth guy on the edge. That and the Chargers kept none of them and rolled in the season with 4, which is kind of generous because you're counting Kyle Van Noy as a full-time edge there. Um, and so again, just based on the way that they've constructed the team in years past, it seems like they only really want to keep 4. I think that, like Ty Shelby was competing for a roster spot sort of last season in an edge room that was a lot weaker than this one is because you just spent a second round pick on Thule. And so I think that there's probably just not room for a fifth one in that rotation. Of course, the exception to this is if one of Mac or Bosa either, Bosa says he feels the best he ever has right after this groin surgery and everything. But if either of them show like any signs of sluggishness, then like maybe you keep a fifth guy just to like for like early season rotation, and he's the guy that you waive to bring someone like a Roundtree or a tight end addition or a running back addition or something up like early in the season. But yeah, otherwise pretty straightforward. I think it's just the four.
Yeah, I think yeah. As I'm looking at our lads right now, they do still have Carlo Kemp, who they signed from the USFL on the
USFL, yeah.
roster. Yeah, so he's still there. If they want, to give him some training camp preseason type of reps. But yeah, I think it's those four. I think Staley's always gone with four. And it's usually been Mac, or well, I guess the first year would have been Bosa and Wosu, then Bosa Mac plus two others.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's pretty standard. I think they're maybe betting on Rumpf to take a step forward there too. But yeah, I do think largely Tuli, once he signs, is probably that edge three that replaces Van Noy. I guess defensive line. What do you think about interior defensive line here?
I have six, and that's
Mm-hmm.
not counting Ogbonnia because I think that he's going to start the year on pub.
Okay.
At least that's what it seems like from like just everything that we've heard so far is just like I think there was something about like he might have to have a second cleanup procedure on the knee. It seems like he's just like not close to coming back. And like we were talking about with Guyton, kind of the same thing of just like it's an early bye week, week 5, and so you can put someone on pup and just give them that like extra month and a half to just get ready for the season. Um, I think that signing Nick Williams in May or whenever that was, I think
Mm-hmm.
kind of points to that as well of just like you get into OTAs and you see Otito, back in the building for the first time and you go, oh yeah, that guy's not going to be ready for the season. And so the, I think 4 obvious ones are Johnson, Joseph Day, Fox, Matlock. And then after that, you have Williams, who I think it's tough because like those May signings, it's like on the one hand, like why would they sign that guy if he's not going to make the team? But on the other hand, like everyone that signs in May is for like zero guaranteed money, and so like if he
Right.
sucks, you can just cut him. But I do have Williams, and then it's kind of a toss up, I think, between Hinton and Gerard Clark. I think Hinton spent some time on the active roster last season and showed some good flashes, in my opinion. Um, Clark was a guy that I know they were interested in drafting in the 7th round before Max Duggan fell to them, and then they just felt better about their chances about getting Clark as a free agent than getting Duggan as a free agent, because the Chargers are not necessarily a team to throw out a ton of guaranteed money as UDFA bidders. Um, I lean towards Hinton making the active roster, just because I think Clark needs a year on a practice squad to just like reshape his body a little bit. There's a lot of bad weight on that frame. Um, and I think that he could eventually be something down the line. I just don't know if you want to carry a guy like that on the 53 that's just like a pure development piece like that. So I kind of lean Hinton. I also think that this is like a bubble spot as well, where like I could see them keeping 5. I could see them keeping Otito on the active roster to start the year. Like there's a lot of like different ways that they could build this. And so I think inevitably, like if they only keep 5, then it opens you up to like, oh, well, you can keep, a 10th DB, I guess it would be. You can take a 5th edge, you can take like a 6th linebacker or something. But like, are you really going to use a guy like that versus just like keeping 6 on the D line, especially again, like with Johnson coming off an injury, Ogbani is going to be coming off an injury, like Joseph Day and Fox, you can't have those guys play like 90-95% of snaps for the most part. So I think eventually you just like the way that the numbers work out, like I feel like I end up with 6 pretty much like every time. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say they'll go with six in general. It's just a combination and like betting on which guys are in that six because, yeah, as much as you said with Otito, like he may not start the season. It's possible Austin Johnson doesn't either, right? Obviously
Sure.
had the season-ending injury last year, so then if you have those two, then it's like, potentially that's a Clark spot to make the roster, or maybe Clark and Hinton, potentially starting the season with those six. That's possible. I tend to think until we're given more information that Austin Johnson will be ready to start the season and Otito won't. So that's kind of like my idea there, and that goes back to like the Nick Williams signing. In my Chargers Wire article that I did this week, just because we don't technically have anything like concrete on Otito not being ready for next month, even though it is like a torn patellar tendon, I put him in. But I think for the purposes of this, if we're just like projecting purely for like the season starting as opposed to like now, I do think that they probably leave Otito on pup and then hope he can come back kind of later in the season. So yeah, I think Johnston, Sebastian Joseph Day, Morgan Fox obviously is on there, Scott, Matlock, and then Nick Williams. And then, I think like you said, it comes down to Hinton and Clark. I would just lean towards familiarity and go with Hinton, and then probably hope that you can get Clark, on the practice squad spot. Not that I think that will be
Yeah.
like too difficult to do. But assuming he does have like the training camp that he's kind of hyped to potentially have, I do think they go with those six. Linebacker, I think, is pretty simple at this point. I do think they end up going with obviously Eric Kendricks and Kenneth Murray kind of as their tandem, at least to start the season. Deion Henley is obviously going to get some push, and then Nick Neiman and Eamon Ogbongbemiga for special teams purposes primarily.
Yep. Pretty straightforward to me too. I think it's again like the three guys that you're leaving off there are Tyreek Maddox Williams, who was on the practice squad last season,
Rutgers legend.
and then two UDFAs, one of whom is like an undersized all ACC linebacker that had a million tackles, but like is probably too small to play in the NFL, and the other one is like a 9.9, a 9 point something RAS score from Samford, which is like an FCS school. And so like maybe that guy, Nathan East, maybe that guy turns into something, and maybe he is a guy that you stash on the practice squad for a year. And again, like if you're looking at something like that, it's like, okay, why not just like go for familiarity on the opening day roster, keep Neiman and Amon, and just have them be your special teams aces, and just like roll with a pretty simple five, basically just swapping Drew Tranquil for Eric Hendricks, and then Troy Reader for Dan Henley, and keeping everything else the same.
Yeah. I just think there's no real situation here where they don't go with five.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no like preceding injury to talk about here. We'll talk about cornerbacks in a second, where I think that comes into play. But for the linebackers, I think it's a pretty straightforward thing now that you do have Kendricks there kind of as your main linebacker, and that kind of goes on down the line. Getting to cornerback here, I think this is kind of the most interesting spot on the defense. You talked about potentially keeping a 10th DB. The guy that I picked for my Chargers Wire article in that respect, because in that article I did keep 3 tight ends as opposed to 4. So then I did keep Keemon Hall, who has been around for a while, as the 6 DB, depending on how fast J.C. Jackson comes along. And also they've just liked using him on special teams in general. That I think is kind of the only like contender for a spot. Realistically, like, because obviously you have Michael Davis, J.C. Jackson, Asante Samuel, Jot Taylor as like kind of your main cornerback components there. And then outside of that, it's really who am I forgetting off the top of my head?
Dean Leonard.
Yeah, Dean Leonard is going to be there for special teams as well. And then I think the only other guy is really Keemon Hall, who's been around for a while. So that's a debate if you want to keep 5 or 6. So yeah, I don't really see anyone else being able to like make the roster. Unfortunately for poor EJ Uzodinma, he's been the factor. He's been on that Chargers social media a little bit too much this week in the videos they've been putting out for minicamp. Maybe he could compete for a practice squad spot. God bless his heart. But I do think that this is a pretty simple 5 or 6, depending on, like we talked about with other positions, what they decide to do with J.C. Jackson's injury and, how fast he is able to turn around. But from what we have so far, I think it is fair to say that they probably go with JC being able to at least play week 1 or not having to go on pup, super early here.
Yeah, it definitely seems like from everything we've been told, JC is going to at least be in a position where if he's not ready to play like week 1, he'll be ready to play
Mm,
by like week 3. Which means that you have to keep him on the 53. You can't put him on, like, you can't stash him on pup. You can't stash him on like an IR boomerang. Like, you can't really do anything with him. So I think that there probably is a world where he makes the initial 53 and then like is inactive for week 1. Um,
yeah.
but I could also see him just suiting up and playing week 1 because it sounds like he's kind of 50-50 in that regard as of right now. Obviously, still a long ways to go, and so like there's a ton that could happen in between there. When I did it earlier today, I did have them keeping just the 5 corners because I do think that JC is going to be an active member of the roster to start the year. I do agree about Kamon Hall though. I think he's the main corner if you're looking at a 6th corner to keep. And it's just a matter of like whether or not they value that special teams versus like someone like Uzodinma or like a I guess would be 4th safety, 5th safety,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which like there are a couple guys that could maybe factor into that discussion, but no one that I'm like really like super stoked about. And so I think that like you said, Kamon Hall is kind of like the first guy on the chopping block there. And like if there's any reason why they need an extra DB, I feel like he'd be the one to keep.
Yeah. And then, yeah, with JC Jackson last year, he didn't play week 1, then came back for week 2, then was out again the Jaguars game, and then I think he started from week 4 to the Seattle game. So,
Yeah, that sounds
yeah,
right.
I think that in that sense, they probably kind of do, obviously, hope it's to a better effectiveness than what they did last year, unfortunately, with his injury. But I think they kind of go a similar route and at least
Yeah.
have him kind of ready to start the year. If it's not necessarily week 1 or week 2, that's fine. But I don't know if, considering the other injuries that we've talked about on this roster too, that you want to use one of those pup spots on him, and then have again another player not able to play until potentially week 6, right? After that bye. So I think that would be kind of tough. Safety room, I guess we can get to that since, yeah, you brought it up. If they want to keep like a 5th safety, that could be like you know, AJ Finley. That could be somebody like that. It could also be Mark Webb, who I think was a Staley like Georgia favorite for a while. But I don't really see them. I don't really see there being room to have a 5th safety, nor necessarily a necessity for it, because at this point you have Derwin, you have Alohi, that's your tandem, and then there's been some John Johnson stuff, obviously, throughout the offseason. They can obviously still make that move, much like we talked about, like running back and tight ends if they want to sign players. But for now, I think it would be those 4. And then if you do sign like a John Johnson, maybe that pushes Alohi to being like the 3rd, and then you keep JT Woods and Raheem Lanes left off of that 4. But yeah, for now, I would just go Derwin, Alohi, JT, and Raheem Lane.
Yep, same thing I have. I think that Lane has kind of taken over that Mark Webb spot as like the guy who has never actually played an NFL game, but everyone is convinced that he will be starter quality if they put him on the field. Um, Mark Webb just seems like he's too injury prone, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think, there's probably a world where Mark Webb comes back and he's healthy for all of training camp and he has like an otherworldly preseason and he beats out Raheem Lane. I don't think that that happens very often, but it certainly is in the realm of possibility. And then again, kind of the same thing as we talked about with tight ends, where I think like you're keeping four regardless. It's just a matter of like, are you keeping the UDFA guy we found last year that we kind of like, or are we keeping a veteran that we're going to sign off the street in August? And so, like you were talking about with John Johnson, it's like, okay, if you sign John Johnson, I think you just leave Raheem Lane off and he goes back to the practice squad or, gets poached on waivers or whatever. And if you don't sign John Johnson, it probably means that they feel confident enough in JT Woods and Raheem Lane as the backup duo to not bump Alohi out of the starting lineup. And so I think in that respect, just given like who's on the roster currently, I think that the four is pretty straightforward. But again, it's one of those spots to watch for like if there's a free agent ad, then things get a little bit more complex fairly quickly.
Yeah, could definitely see it getting a little bit more complex if they decide to do the John Johnson thing, like we've said. But for now, I do think that four is pretty straightforward. Also, pretty straightforward is two of the special team spots. You do have Josh Harris, and you have why am I not remembering the punter's name off the top of my head?
J.K.
Uh,
Scott.
what's his name?
J.K. Scott.
Yeah, J.K. Scott. We have J.K. Scott and we have Josh Harris. Um, Dicker Hopkins battle. Any early thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I mean, it sounds like everything that they've said so far has made it seem like it's going to be a true competition and there's no real like favorite, like clubhouse favorite yet. That said, I think that that's the thing that you have to say when the veteran option is a guy that you sign to a 3-year contract and is like the first stable Chargers kicker in a decade. um,
Right,
but also like Cameron Dicker didn't do anything during the season to lose that job. Dustin Hopkins didn't really either, except for tear his hamstring.
right.
Um, and so it is just a little bit tough. I think like it's a good position for the Chargers to be in and one that they haven't been in for, again, like close to a decade, where you have two NFL caliber kickers. Um, I do think at the end of the day, it probably ends up being Dicker, just like younger, more cost controlled, like better, a little bit better cap wise, like with his up as close up against the cap as the Chargers are right now. You want to save money pretty much wherever you can. I think Hopkins cap hit is somewhere in like the 1.5 million range or something. Like it's not huge by any means, but Cameron Dicker's cap hit is like 870,000 or something. Um, and like I do think it's going to come down to just like the way that they perform in the preseason and everything. But initially, I feel like I lean Dicker over Hopkins right now.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Just I think in terms of age and like the money difference not being as huge as maybe perceived to be thought between them because like you said, I think if they do just like a dead cap post June 1st thing, it's like 1.2 million maybe. And then
Yeah,
obviously if you were to go the other way and cut Dicker, then it's just 875,000. So it's not that different if you decide to cut one, not the other, based off of what I've seen so far in terms of Dicker and Hopkins. But yeah, I do think it is the difference between having like a stable kicker, like you said, or you kind of betting on the upside of a younger guy. But I think Dicker has kind of shown his stuff enough to the point where you can put him in. Obviously, like the margins for kicker are so thin that like it takes one bad preseason game to potentially knock you off, right? As
right.
we've seen in other Chargers preseasons where there's maybe been a close race and then one guy just goes like 1 for 4 in a preseason game and then it's over, right?
Yeah.
So we've had stuff like that. But yeah, for now, I think Dicker kind of has the advantage here. Um, but for so far, for what it's been in OTAs per Eric Smith and Daniel Popper and some of the other people have written about it, it's been fairly even. And, it's going to take some more time to kind of separate this out. But yeah, kind of only stinks that you can keep one of those guys. I would be interested to see if there is like a kicker injury on another team or something. If you can kind of do the move the Jags did with like Riley Patterson, where it's like, okay, maybe we can like trade him if we're gonna take McManus and then flip him to Detroit for like a future seventh, right? So
Right.
if the Chargers could like find a way to do that with like Hopkins or Dicker, depending on which one loses the competition, and then maybe you get like a future draft pick or something like that, depending on what the other team's like kicking situation is. So that could be like an option as opposed to a straight cut. A straight cut probably more likelier because teams probably aren't going to give you like free draft picks for kickers. Just kind of a very expendable position, but there are some instances. So I do think we've counted the numbers correctly. So this is 53 players, I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
So
6, 9,
here we go. Jeopardy sounds like
36.
Yeah, because this is
Yes.
basically the
Yeah.
same roster. Okay, there's the thumbs up. This is basically the same roster, different Chargers wire, except I swapped Stone Smart for Keemon Hall in that one. So
Yeah.
depending on what you do there and depending on how you manage certain injuries, obviously it can change a little bit. But this is our 53-man roster. Took 41 minutes, is longer than I thought we would go. But let us know what you guys think of this 53-man roster. Any agreements, disagreements you have down in the comments below. Alex, let the people know where they can find you and your stuff this upcoming season.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Alex Katson, the way you see it spelled on the screen. I'll be teaming up with the other Alex this season over at Chargers Wire. Gavino and I convinced him to come aboard, and so we've got some big stuff planned for this season for Chargers content. I'm also going to be doing a whole bunch of college football content and draft content and all sorts of that stuff, kind of all over the place this year. I have a whole list of places that I'm contributing this year. And so honestly, the easiest way to find all of it is just to go to my Twitter account and look for all of it. But yeah, I think I feel good about this projection. I think that, this is an early clubhouse favorite to get 53 out of 53 for the first time. Last year, Gavino and I got 52. So
what was the one that you missed on?
Oh gosh. I think we got Dean Leonard. I think the one that we missed might have been, I think we left, I want to say I think we kept a fifth edge. I think we had Jamal Davis making the roster over I can't remember if it was the fourth running back or the third quarterback or something else on defense, but I think that's what it was, is we kept Jamal Davis. And had 5 edges on the team because we were bought in on the Kyle Van Noy is going to play traditional linebacker thing. And then every edge got injured and Van Noy played edge.
Yeah, not a bad projection until, unfortunately, the whole team fell flat on its face injury-wise.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, Kyle Van Noy had to be edge 3. But worked out for Kyle Van Noy in terms of his production. He's still unsigned, right?
Yep, still available.
Someone will get him. Chargers drafted Dooley, so don't think it'll be the Chargers. But
No.
and he sort of said that he's ready to move on from the Chargers too, and the Chargers are ready to move on from him. But wish him the best, of course. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of Bolt Breakdowns. See you guys next time, and as always, bolt up.